Good morning, buenos dias, good morgen, right? I am very happy to welcome all of you, and I think we'll soon have a good many more people here as well, to our conference entitled President Trump's Populism, Lessons from Europe and Latin America. I'm Jenny Gerard. I'm director of Lilas Benson, which is our Institute of Latin American Studies here at University of Texas. We're sponsoring this conference along with, we have a good list of co-sponsors here, which is something that's very exciting for me. The Center for European Studies, the Institute of Historical Studies, which is out of the History Department, College of Liberal Arts, and also I believe the Department of Government has given some significant help to this, in part by lending us Curt, Weyland, and Raúl Madrid, who have done a masterful job in conceptualizing this conference and putting it together. It has a lot of moving parts, and I think they have made it look very easy to do when it's not easy at all. One of the things that excites me particularly about this event is that we often at the university, and I think in many areas of our life, we tend to speak to those we know, people who we are comfortable with and people who are like us in many ways. And even when we stretch out of our comfort zones, we don't reach very far. I think, one of the things that should happen at universities is they should provide a venue for real conversation that isn't always about easy things. It should provoke sometimes. It should certainly challenge us to think about things differently. And it should reach across areas. And so to bring this conversation about populism together across a variety of areas, across, as we talk about Latin America, we talk about Europe, we talk about the United States. I don't know why we don't do this more often, but I hope that today will be sort of a template for other types of conversations that will come about later. It's surprising that this is such a unique opportunity, but I am just thrilled that we could be a part of it. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Raúl, who will take over from here.
Well, thank you, Jenny. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of the participants as well as the audience to the conference. We've really got an all-star lineup here, which I'm very excited about. I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors, whom Jenny mentioned, the Lilas Benson Collection, the College of Liberal Arts, Center for European Studies, the Mike Hogg Professorship in Liberal Arts. Kirk is the Mike Hogg Professor. The Department of Government, Institute for Historical Studies, and then, of course, a special thanks is owed to Virginia Gerard, as well as Douglas Bia, who couldn't be here, who are the directors of the Institute for Latin American Studies and the Center for European Studies here at the University of Texas. And, of course, last but not least, Paloma Diaz of Lilas, who has helped organize the conference, along with Curt and myself. So the conference is going to be live streamed, okay? So by being here, you are essentially giving consent to being filmed. If you don't like that, you're going to have to leave. You could, watch from that window or something. The fundamental goal of this conference is to examine to what extent European and Latin American experiences with populism can help us understand the likely impact on populism in the United States, and specifically the populism of President Donald Trump. However, as is well known, there is considerable debate about what populism consists of. Some scholars define populism as an anti-establishment discourse or ideology that portrays the world as a struggle between the pure people and the corrupt elites. Others define it as a political strategy in which a personalistic leader seeks to mobilize the unorganized masses in a top-down and unmediated manner. And still others employ definitions that include both of these elements as well as other characteristics, such as outsider status, a coarse, popular political style, economic nationalism, etc. So the first question is, how can we assess whether Trump is a populist if we can't even agree on what populism is? We have no interest in this conference in entering into these thorny and endless conceptual debates about what populism is. There are plenty of readings I could give you if you're interested in that, and authored by many of the people here. But let me emphasize that by any of these definitions that I've mentioned, Trump is a populist. Certainly he employs anti-elite rhetoric and claims to represent the popular will. For example, in a 2016 op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, he wrote, "The only antidotes to decades of ruinous rule by a small handful of elites is a bold infusion of popular will. On every major issue affecting this country, the people are right and the governing elite are wrong." So that is classic populist rhetoric. He's also a highly personalistic leader who concentrates power in himself and has sought to appeal to the masses directly through rallies, through tweets, dispensing with organizational mediation. He's also a political outsider with a lowbrow political style that some might describe as coarse, who has embraced, at least rhetorically, trade protectionism and other economic nationalist policies. The many affinities that Trump shares with populist leaders in Europe and Latin America means that we can learn much from a comparison of them. A study of previous populist experiences should shed light on how Trump might affect democracy and what the opposition can do in response. So that is essentially the themes we will be discussing today. Now our first speaker of the day, Curt Weyland, needs no introduction to most of you. He is the Mike Hogg Professor of Government, as I mentioned. I love that title. He's also a co-organizer of the conference, and he has written extensively on populism, among other topics. And he'll be presenting a paper entitled "President Trump's Populism in Comparative Perspective." We also have two discussants today, the first of whom also needs no introduction. Daniel Brinks is Associate Professor of Government here at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also our famed and talented graduate advisor. And he has written extensively on a range of issues having to do with democracy in Latin America. And then our other discussant is Steve Levitsky, Professor of Government at Harvard University. He is in the process of completing a co-authored book with Daniel Ziblatt on populism entitled "How Democracies Die." So we're going to start with Curt, who will speak for 15 minutes, and then we will followed up by our discussants. So with no further ado.
So since this conference is about, mind if I don't wear my indication of academic status here, because it might heat up a little. So populism. When people hear populism, they think about threat to democracy. They worry, right? Because populist leaders are personalistic, so they see institutions as hindrances. The institutions that in liberal democracy are supposed to protect civil liberties, those kinds of things, for populists is an obstacle to be pushed aside. Liberal democracy wants to disperse power. Populists want to concentrate power. Populist leaders also have a direct, uninstitutionalized relationship with their followers. So in order to maintain that relationship, they want to make it particularly intense and fervent. So they want to have enemies. They seek enemies. The risk there is for liberal democracy that this deliberate seeking of enemies delegitimates the opposition. Populist leaders want to turn the opposition not into a legitimate competitor, but into a foe. And so there's another threat to democracy that emerges from populism. So what you see, therefore, is that populism inherently poses a threat to democracy. So when Donald Trump won the presidential election last year, a lot of people were worried, whoa, so does this pose a threat to democracy in the United States? But people, of course, didn't know, because fortunately for this country, you haven't had a populist in the presidency in more than 150 years. So how do we assess whether there's a real threat or not? So what we thought is, look, there have been experiences with populists in government in many other regions of the world, especially Latin America and Europe. So why don't we invite a bunch of leading experts and say, let's see what lessons can we draw from the Latin American experiences with populism, from the European experiences with populism, where some of these populist leaders like Chávez strangled democracy, where other leaders like Berlusconi didn't get quite that far, where Viktor Orbán in Hungary again tries to kind of strangle democracy. What do we make of this? What applies to the United States? What doesn't? And can these foreign experiences help us shed light on the prospects of the Trump presidency and on the potential damage that the man can do to US democracy? Now, if you do that learning from other regions, obviously you have to take into account the significant contextual differences. You know, what plays out in Venezuela hopefully won't play out here. So there are three contextual differences that I think are especially important that we should really take into account. One in the institutional framework, in the party system, and then in conjunctural challenges. Institutional framework. The United States has a firm system of checks and balances. Presidentialism means that you call the US president the most powerful person in the world, and they are powerful in many ways because he could, with his little left finger, nuke North Korea. But inside American politics, the president actually isn't all that strong because there's Congress and there are the courts and they have him in. It's different from European experiences because in most European countries you have parliamentary systems that have comparatively weak checks and balances. In Latin America you have on paper presidential systems, but even in the constitution, many Latin American presidents have way more power and attribution than the US president has domestically. And where you have checks and balances, in Latin America, often presidents can, through informal machinations, grab more power. And so checks and balances in Latin America, despite the formal similarities, often don't work quite like that. So that's a significant contextual difference that we need to take into account. Second, think about parties. Many populist leaders create their own electoral vehicles that they totally control. Hugo Chávez created his party from the top down practically. Fujimori in Peru changed his party or created a new party for every new election. He ran that kind of party. Very different in the United States because President Trump has to deal with the Republican Party, and the Republican Party didn't like President Trump, right? Because there were 16 other candidates hoping they could avoid that man taking over the candidacy, but they were unsuccessful. So what you see is Trump is in some sense hemmed in by his own, if it even is his own party. Similar in many ways in that respect to President Menem in Argentina, because Menem in Argentina had to deal with the Peronist party that was there before Menem. Menem tried to take it over and he controlled it for a while, but in the end the Peronist party, when Menem wanted to run for another consecutive re-election, another person in the Peronist party said, Menem, step aside, now it's my turn and you are going to essentially not run again. And so it was his own party, in some sense, that helped protect Argentine democracy from self-perpetuation in power. And so that's similar to Trump in that sense, and different from many other populist leaders. The third difference is in some sense surprising or paradoxical. President Trump is one of the few populist leaders who won office, although the country was not suffering an acute, severe crisis. That's something that is especially important for right-wing populist leaders. Like, think of Fujimori in Peru. Fujimori came to power in the midst of hyperinflation, 6,000% inflation in the year 1990. So Fujimori came to office, Fujimori, boom, cut down inflation. Ton of people were happy. His popularity soared. He massively extended his support. And with that massive support, he could essentially get away with a self-coup. He could change the constitution. He could win re-election and dominate Peruvian politics for 10 years. President Trump, since the United States wasn't in an acute severe crisis, in some sense doesn't have that opportunity. He doesn't face a big crisis that he can just defeat, that he can overcome and win that massive support. So that's another difficulty that Trump faces in extending his mass support. So you see three significant contextual differences that we need to take into account today when we try to draw lessons from Latin American and European experiences on the prospects of the Trump presidency. So what issues and questions should we look at in light of these contextual differences when we draw lessons from European and Latin American experiences? There are three things. One is what are the strategies with which Trump will try to push his agenda and enhance his support? So what are Trump's options? Second, how can the opposition try to contain him? What are their options and their strategies, and what is likely to work out in the US? And then number three, the fundamental point, what's the likely impact on democracy? What can we infer about the prospects of US democracy? Is liberal democracy in the United States going to survive Trump, or is he going to be the next Fujimori, Chávez, whatever, who is going to override and infringe on and distort or maybe even strangle democracy in the US? So, Trump. Populist leaders by nature employ confrontation, polarization. They are attack dogs. And as I told you, they need to do that in order to win fervent support from their followers. They want to tie these people to themselves. The question is, of course, can that be successful in the United States with these checks and balances? Can that be successful with a political party that Trump, his own so-called own political party, that Trump doesn't even control that much? I mean, when you think about all the fights he has gotten into, even with Republicans in Congress, will this confrontational style that he employs, like a typical populist, will it essentially set him up for failure? You know, so far he hasn't gotten very much done, for example, in Congress. Or, paradoxically, can he use that resulting gridlock and stalemate at some point to say, look, this whole thing doesn't work. What we need to do is I'm going to override these constraints. Congress is an obstacle that is in the path of the will of the people. I'm going to infringe on these constraints. You know, Congress is not held in very high esteem in the United States. It's in some sense a risk because, you know, if you say like Congress is a bunch of particularistic politicians, I embody the will of the people, get out of my way, you might actually get away with some infringements on congressional rights. So that's the risk that this confrontational style could pose. Another question is, how will Trump try to maintain and augment his mass support? I think due to the absence of that severe crisis that didn't allow Trump to win this massive upswelling of support that, like, for example, Fujimori won, he has, in many ways, taken a strategy that's also in line with his confrontational style of trying to firm up support from his limited mass base, the kind of the diehards, you know, the deplorables and their friends. So, of course, that means that if you just appeal to that base and you keep going with your confrontational style, how are you going to augment your mass support? How are you going to eventually, you know, lead your, if it's even your party, to victory in the midterm elections? How are you going to win re-election? Is he just setting himself up for failure again by having such a narrow appeal that is related to his confrontational style? And the Republicans have limited patience with a man, right? If they are foreseeing a disaster in 2018, or they are seeing that Trump's star isn't very good for the next presidential election, they might try to get rid of the man. So Trump faces challenges. The opposition faces challenges too. They face a dilemma too. Because how do you confront a populist? Do you try to imitate it and become similarly populist? Also, populists are confrontational, right? They want to make enemies. They want to provoke you. So do you go for it and say, hey, we are going to counterattack, we're going to protest, we are going to give you heat? Which in some sense plays into a populist leader's hand. They want enemies. If you play the enemy, you do protests, you know, like Berkeley, whatever, like, yeah, 1-0 for Donald Trump, because he can say, see that radical left, okay? So, should the opposition go for a kind of an extra parliamentary protest strategy or an institutional strategy trying to entrap Trump in these checks and balances, in these constraints, try to peel Republican support off from Trump? The Republicans aren't very much in his favor on many policy issues anyway. How do you try to constrain and contain the man? International experiences show that the protest strategy is risky. It's a dangerous strategy. Think of the Venezuelan case. Hugo Chávez occupied institutional venues, established political hegemony, the opposition. What are we going to do? We can't easily work through the institutions. Let's go out in the streets and protest and strikes and whatever, even a coup attempt. That backfired. It played into Chávez's hand. It enhanced the polarization. It strengthened Chávez. It radicalized Chávez. So, protest strategy, potentially dangerous. Given the strength of institutional checks and balances in the US, given the tension-filled relationship of Trump with his own party, an institutional strategy might be much more promising for the Democrats. Try to forge some kind of compromise with Republicans in Congress or with President Trump and leave the Republicans out, try to divide them, drive a wedge between them, and in that sense make it even harder for Trump to override these constraints and these limitations that he faces. You want to take advantage of the gulf between Trump and the Republican leadership. But you also want to avoid confrontation because you don't want to kind of drive the Republican Party into supporting Trump's potential effort to override these institutional constraints. Congress is bad, we're just going to govern with decree, whatever. So, institutional strategy might be more promising than a protest strategy. Another issue that the Democratic Party faces is how to maintain and extend their mass support. One of the most shocking things of the 2016 elections was that a bunch of the working class base of the Democratic Party actually ended up supporting Trump. So whoa, they're taking them for granted in Michigan and Pennsylvania, wherever in the Midwest, and woof, they supported Trump. What a crazy thing to do, right? So these deplorables support that flashy, extravagant multi-billionaire, but they did. So what does that mean for the Democratic Party? Is it going to reorient and trying to win back some of those people? Are they going to shift from what they've been doing, kind of heavy emphasis on identity politics, towards more kind of bread and butter economic and social issues? How do you try to win back some of these deplorables? Which I think is also a challenge for us in academia. Because we think, these deplorables, they're fearful, they're resentful, just keep them quiet. But maybe it's better to kind of listen and see what they have to say. Is there some aspect that can be addressed rather than just ignoring and neglecting them? So that's the question for the Democratic Party. Are you going to try to recapture some of the deplorable working class base? And how would you end up doing that while keeping your party together? Okay, so those are some of the issues, those are some of the options that we need to consider. Now, from my perspective, when I put all these things together, kind of the little lessons that I tried to draw from Latin American and European experiences, considering the contextual differences in the United States, the institutional framework, the party system, the absence of a deep crisis, from my perspective, a pretty provocative conclusion emerges, which is, I don't think that Trump is going to get away with doing much damage to American democracy. I think that he's caught in a web of limitations and constraints, partly because his governing style is so unpredictable and unsystematic. He's not actually even using his potential options in a skillful way. I don't see him winning a ton of mass support because he doesn't have that crisis, and he appeals to his narrow base. So I see Trump essentially as kind of a big failure when you compare him with other populist leaders who were way more skillful trying to weave their way through the political constellation in the country. I don't think he'll end up doing lasting damage to American democracy. What I actually think is, I think we often think kind of too linear way. Trump itself is not only a cause, but also a symptom. There's serious problems with American democracy. Trump is creating precedents that other people are going to then employ in the future. I think what might happen is the opposite. I think it might be that you see Trump here violating norms of democracy, the whole kind of public-private collusion, the coerce language, all these kinds of things. And when Trump falls by the wayside, which might not be all that long in the coming, that I think there might be a pro-democratic backlash, that people say, never again. I mean, we have to make sure that somebody like that can't win the presidency. You have to make sure that people don't get away with this. It might reinforce commitment to those norms that Trump infringes on and violates. And when you think of it, we've begun to see such a pro-democratic backlash already in Europe. Because when you think last fall, it was like, oh, this amazing wave of populism is sweeping across the Western world and the whole West is whatever. And there's the Dutch election. And what happened in the Dutch election? Builders seemed to be poised for more of an electoral victory. But the Dutch said, ooh, that guy looks too similar to Trump. Let's not vote for that guy. And boom, Marine Le Pen, ooh, she might be the next president. And people said, whoa, you know, she looks too similar to Trump. Let's not vote for her. And boom. So you see kind of the deterrent effect of Trump, I think, already on the international scene. And I think he might well have a similar kind of deterrent effect on the US political system. And you see that also in international experiences. Brazil had a right-wing populist, Fernando Collor de Mello, in the early 1990s. He faced hyperinflation. He defeated hyperinflation. Initially had a lot of support. He was kind of undemocratic, but he failed with his economic policies. He was impeached on corruption charges, and the Brazilians said, never again. And they, in many ways, Brazilian democracy improved as a result of the Collor experience because of that kind of pro-democratic backlash. I think you see a little bit of that right now in Argentina, where after the long rule of the Kirchners that was kind of a little problematic for democracy, people were relieved, and Macri, I think, is getting a good amount of support, not only from right-wingers and neoliberals, but also from people who are worried about liberal democracy. And so my I don't know, hunch, hope, is that the Trump experience is not going to be, ooh, the president that sets the US up for failure. It might be kind of like, oh my God, whew, we avoided that thing here, never again. Okay, so that's the little hopeful, provocative start. I know that Steve has a very different view, so we want to see what he has to counter. Thank you.
Listed you first.
Oh, it's me? Should I go up there?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Am I heard okay? So Curt is always smart and provocative and has been again, and so that's not new. What's new here is he's declaring himself an optimist. Right, so he tells us he doesn't think Trump's populism is going to inflict much damage on U.S. democracy. And his optimistic conclusion is based on a thoughtful and entirely reasonable comparison, I think, with prominent cases, mostly of Latin American populism. Curt sees three big differences, just to repeat, between the U.S. and these Latin American cases. The U.S. has stronger institutions of checks and balances. Trump's got a real party, which can constrain him. And Trump didn't take power, didn't get elected in a context of a crisis. And I think these 3 points are basically correct. And I agree with Curt that there's a good chance that U.S. democracy will, in fact, muddle through the Trump presidency. But I want to be a little more pessimistic. So I think each of these 3 points is open to at least some questions, some uncertainty. Let's start with checks and balances. Yes, U.S. checks and balances have been pretty effective over the last century. Not over 200 years, but over the last century for sure. But constitutional checks and balances everywhere, including the United States, are never self-enacting. They only work well when they are reinforced, when they're embedded in a set of effective, robust democratic norms. And in our forthcoming book, Dan Ziblatt and I focus on 2 norms in particular that we think are critical. One is what we call mutual toleration, or the norm of accepting one's partisan rival as legitimate, not treating them as traitors, subversives, otherwise beyond the pale. We'll get back to that. The other norm is what we call institutional forbearance, or deploying one's institutional prerogatives with restraint. In other words, not using the letter of the law to explicitly violate the spirit of the law. Think about, for example, presidential impeachment, or Senate approval of Supreme Court nominations, or the filibuster, or court packing, or presidential pardons. if politicians were to use any of these prerogatives to the hilt, to the letter of the law, exploiting the letter of the law for maximum personal or partisan gain, our system of checks and balances would pretty quickly devolve into deadlock and dysfunction. Paraguayan-style impeachment, Argentine-style court packing are perfectly constitutional in the United States. It's not the Constitution that prevents them. It's underlying norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. A question, which I'll return to, is whether those norms in the United States are now weakening. Curt says Trump is constrained by the Republican Party, and that is true, but only to a point. First of all, presidents enjoy quite a bit of autonomy from their parties in presidential democracies, particularly when they are the ones who are a primary deliverer of votes. Second, I think more important than that, the Republican Party has been completely hollowed out over the last 20 or 30 years. The power of outside donor groups, of the Tea Party, and particularly of right-wing media, has reduced the Republican establishment, has reduced the Republican Party leadership really to a shell of what it once was. It really barely exists. But I think most importantly of all, in affecting Republicans' capacity or willingness to stand up to Trump is partisan polarization. Most Republican leaders despise Trump. In fact, many Republican leaders think he is crazy. They think he's nuts. They're terrified of what he might do. But none of them, no major Republican, was willing to endorse Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election because as awful and scary and terrifying as they think Trump is, either they or their base consider the Democrats even worse. Partisan polarization gives Trump a lot of room to maneuver, far more than, say, Nixon had half a century ago. Finally, Curt says Trump is less dangerous because he was elected in the absence of a crisis. This is not Peru in 1990. That is a very important point. Trump could do much, much more damage if he had the massive public support that Fujimori or Chávez or Correa had. And really, in the US, only a crisis could generate that kind of support. But it doesn't mean we're out of the woods, right? We're in year one of Trump's presidency. A crisis, particularly a security crisis, could happen at any time. The chances of a war or a major terrorist attack are not insignificant. 6 of our last 12 elected presidents have been involved in a major land war. This administration could easily bumble itself into a war, and it could easily be the target of a significant terrorist attack. We don't know, but the probability is clearly higher than 0. So Curt's right. I think the odds favor us, democratic institutions, muddling through. But the odds are far from 100%. A security crisis remains entirely possible, and neither our institutions nor the Republican Party are fail-safe checks at this point. I'll get back to that point. To me, actually, the biggest constraint on Trump's authoritarianism, something Curt did mention but didn't talk too much about, may be his inability to mobilize sizable majorities on his behalf. If the United States were West Virginia, which is where Trump is most popular, his approval rating is well over 60%, I think we'd be in some serious trouble. But nationally, Trump's populist support base is relatively small. It is much smaller than that of Chávez, Fujimori, Correa, Morales. This is partly due to the absence of crisis, as Curt pointed out correctly. It's partly due to the intensity of partisanship. Despite the handful of working class voters who voted for Trump, the vast majority of Democrats would never support Trump, in the absence of crisis anyway. But it's also his inability to mobilize a Chavez-like massive support base is rooted in the nature of his populism. And this is another difference between the United States and Latin American cases. Trump's populism has an essential racial and cultural component. White nationalism is what gives Trumpism its intensity, it's what gives it its robustness. But it also places a ceiling upon it. It limits its political reach. So whereas a populist appeal could mobilize 70, 80% of Venezuelans, Peruvians, Bolivians, US populism, at least this form of it, because it's tinged with white nationalism, turns off most Americans. It turns off the nearly 40% of the population that is non-white, But it also turns off a fair number of urban whites, people like Curt and me. So it's hard to imagine Trumpism building the kind of robust, big majority coalition that we saw in, say, Bolivia, Venezuela, or even Hungary. And I think that ultimately will be a constraint. But I'm getting too optimistic. I want to end on a more pessimistic note. U.S. democracy may well survive Trump's populism, but the challenges facing U.S. democracy are deeper than Trump. And I want to focus briefly on two challenges in particular. One is intense partisan polarization. Democrats and Republicans today despise one another. The percentage of Republicans who say they would be displeased if their child married a Democrat was 5% in 1960. It's 50% today. Last year, a Pew survey found that 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said the other party makes them afraid. They're afraid of the other party. We've not seen this level of partisan animosity since the end of Reconstruction, since the 1880s. And this is not just traditional left-right polarization. Left and right don't like each other. It's rooted in race, in religion, in culture. It's about identity. It's about our way of life. And that can be deeply and intensely polarizing. That polarization is beginning to erode democratic norms in the United States. And this is the second challenge that I want to point to. Norms of mutual toleration and of forbearance serve essentially as the soft guardrails of our democratic system. They prevent normal political competition, healthy political competition, from spinning out of control into a partisan fight to the death. Now, American democracy has not always had those norms. It didn't have them in the late 18th and early 19th century when partisan warfare between Federalists and Republicans nearly destroyed our new republic. It certainly didn't have them between the 1850s and the late 1870s when the country descended into civil war. But beginning in the 1880s, beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans pretty broadly accepted one another as legitimate rivals and largely refrained or resisted destabilizing acts of what had been called constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments. There were no successful court packings. Senators were pretty restrained in their use of filibusters and other tools of obstruction. They were restrained in their use of the right to advice and consent in presidential appointments. And outside of war, presidents largely refrained from acting unilaterally to circumvent the courts or Congress. So yes, checks and balances basically worked. But norms of mutual toleration and of forbearance are now eroding over the last 20, 30, 35 years. An important faction of the Republican Party now questions the legitimacy of its Democratic rivals. They describe Democrats and liberals as traitors, as not real Americans. Many of them openly questioned whether Barack Obama was in fact a legitimate president, whether he was an American. Now, that kind of extremism has always existed in the United States, but it's always been, in the 20th century, it was confined to the fringes of politics. But now it is entering into the Republican mainstream. So in 2008, Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin showed strikingly low levels of partisan tolerance. In 2016, the Republicans nominated a birther, somebody who openly questioned President Obama's legitimacy as president and who called his partisan rival a criminal. In other words, top-of-the-ticket Republicans have now begun to deny the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. This is pretty new. The decline or the erosion of mutual toleration induces politicians to abandon forbearance. When we view our political opponents as enemies, when we view them as un-American, as a threat to our way of life, it creates a temptation for politicians to employ any means necessary to keep those guys from winning. Because if they are a threat to our country, a threat to our way of life, then that justifies things like denying the opposing party a Supreme Court seat. That induces politicians to abandon the forbearance that is so essential to the checks and balances that Curt has so much faith in. An early sign of the erosion of this forbearance was Clinton's impeachment in 1998. Another was the Texas redistricting of 2003. Another was the increasingly routine deployment of the filibuster as an obstructionist tactic, or the use of government shutdowns and the threat of default as tools of partisan warfare. And finally, and to me most egregiously, the Senate's outright refusal in 2016 to allow President Obama to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, an act that was without precedent since 1866. So the problem is not just that Americans have elected a populist demagogue for the first time since Andrew Jackson. It's that we elected a populist demagogue at a time when our democratic norms, a time when our democratic guardrails were eroding, were coming unmoored. Trump is accelerating that norm erosion, but he's not the source of the problem. And that means that the problem is likely to persist after, even if we're successful in constraining and defeating Trump. So Trump is a challenge, but the fundamental challenge, the real challenge, is polarization, driven by a radicalized Republican Party that has come to represent a declining white Christian majority whose members increasingly perceive themselves to face an existential threat. That problem is not about to go away, so I continue to worry. I'm sorry if I went over.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to say something, and I agree with Steve that the question that's been posed for us is interesting, and Curt's presentation is always interesting and challenging. And so I'm, like Steve, I think a little bit, I'm going to agree with him a little bit and disagree with him a little bit and be overall a little more pessimistic. But I'm going to start with what might seem like a little bit of a tangent, and yet I think it's central to what we're talking about here today. In a way, I'm a little bit surprised that the question for this conference is whether our democracy and our institutions are at risk, and none of us are asking about the state of our democracy and our institutions in the time running up to Trump's election, right? It is as if everything were fine, and then suddenly Trump appears out of nowhere. So let me run quickly through a checklist of what I think are some relatively serious problems with our democracy already, and Steve has mentioned a couple of these, but not all of them. So we've always done this, more at different times of our history than at others, but we are now increasingly limiting the franchise based on membership in particular social groups, right? So depending on the group, you might be precluded from voting because of legal prohibitions, right? This affects an incredibly high percentage of African American males and urban young males generally. We've created a number of very high barriers to voting, which affects any of a dozen groups, including the elderly, the poor, recent immigrants, all kinds of people who might otherwise be participating in our politics. And even sort of a softer constraint, I think the nature of our two-party system and some of the politics around it have bred a feeling that the current two-party system doesn't represent a lot of people's interests, and so they stay out. We routinely, and so far entirely legally, disenfranchise based on ideology by gerrymandering districts, right? So in particular, in some parts of the country, people are cut out or their vote is meaningless or is heavily diluted because of their ideology, because of gerrymandering. And we do it based on class all the time, again, legally. We do it based on race and ethnicity when we can get away with it, increasingly now, and I think, and I'm going to say something about the courts in a minute, but increasingly I think we'll be able to get away with that, although so far it hasn't been legal. We're getting increasingly far from anything that resembles one person, one vote. With an electoral college and a Senate that dramatically overrepresent rural conservative voters, underrepresent urban voters, underrepresent populous states, and therefore skew the electorate away from a large part of the population that's younger, more liberal, more educated, et cetera. And while we protect freedom of speech pretty well, pretty aggressively in this country, if money is speech, as the Supreme Court reminds us all the time, then it's pretty clear that some people in particular and corporate interests in general get to speak a lot more than some others. And that sort of exacerbates a general incumbency advantage because incumbency attracts money, and that also. So at this point, I mean, if we were looking at this system comparatively from scratch, we might legitimately question whether our elections are fair. They might be free, but I'm not sure that they're fair. And although we nominally extend the franchise to all adults, and then we cut out exceptions, we might well begin to question whether we really have a universal franchise, or at least how universal that franchise is. So on each of these points, thinking comparatively might lead us to question how democratic we were before the election. And that may seem a little tangential, but I think I'm going to come back to it at the end, and I think it'll be connected to the question we're asking here. So I do think it's worth asking whether Trump, as a populist president, can do further damage to what I've described as an already problematic institutional framework. And here I'm generally in agreement with Curt's comments. I mean, I agree with the specifics of them, although I'm maybe quite a bit more concerned, a little bit more concerned, at least somewhat more concerned. In particular, so I agree that Trump's lack of a party makes him less dangerous. I can't see him, for example, in this. If we look comparatively, one of the first tasks of every populist president has been to amend the Constitution and create a better institutional framework for what they want to do. I can't see Trump being able to amend the Constitution to favor himself, although we've seen our own Texas governor advocating for a state-led convention to amend the Constitution in a way that would favor the Republican Party, not necessarily Trump. I don't think that's the path forward for Trump in any event. I agree that the lack of a crisis hurts Trump's ambitions, but with Steve, I worry very much about a foreign policy or a catastrophic domestic terrorism event and what effect that might have, in particular on religious liberties, freedom of expression, and so on. But I think the crucial question for us, and the question that I want to talk about a little bit more, is whether our system of institutional checks and balances is strong enough to tie him up in knots, setting the stage for eventually moving him out of office, or whether it is itself at risk during his presidency, setting the stage for his perpetuation in office. And I have many of the same concerns that Steve has on this point. I agree generally with Curt's idea that we should use an institutional strategy, but I'm, in the first place, not sure that you can't use a two-pronged strategy, right? Certainly the congressional delegation could pursue legislative strategies while people mobilize outside. And I'm not sure whether that's really a good, strong, long-term strategy for reasons I'm going to talk about in a second. So the reason I think a two-pronged strategy might be important is that, after all, the only way forward out of this, if we think we need to get out of this, as most of us here probably do, is through elections. And I think you have to get people to participate, and that has been a challenge. And I think a sort of more vigorous, not purely institutional strategy might help to get people motivated. Telling people to stay home while you try institutional solutions and negotiate with the Republicans may not be the best strategy for a strong democratic showing in 2018 or beyond. But then the question is, would that sort of vigorous protest erode popular support for institutional rules, the sort of the bedrock for our institutional foundation? And here I'm really in agreement with Steve's comments. I'm not at all sure about the strength of the support for our institutional rules. We've done away with the filibuster rule with no protest. The Republicans have refused to meet with a presidential nominee for the Supreme Court and certainly didn't lose any votes because of that. I think, in fact, we can attribute a lot of the votes for Trump in the election to the fact that that seat was still open. Trump has violated countless other norms of political behavior, and so far the main response from his base has been glee, and from Republicans in Congress has been silence, right, or complicity, right, or going one better, right? And so in that sense, I'm not sure which are the rules that we think are so dear that if the Republicans violated them to get a policy advantage, they would pay a heavy electoral cost, either in the midterm or in the next presidential election. I just don't see which ones those are. But let me put that aside also and say I think there's a lot of harm in the absence of the informal norms that Steve has talked about. I think there's a ton of harm that Trump can do without breaking the rules. in part because our formal rules are pretty weak. I'm not, so I think there's one thing he can do that he's already done, and that is partly, he's partly a symptom, but also a cause. And that is awakening the ethno-nationalist impulses, right? His speech before the UN, his appeal to national identity, all that stuff has been dormant in American politics, always present, but sort of dormant and obscured. And clearly, if anybody appealed to identity politics in the last election, it was Trump, much more, or at least as much, depending on how you read it, as the Democrats. And that, I think, will have a really long-lasting effect. When Ann Coulter says that the American electorate is not shifting, but shrinking, she's saying essentially what Steve said, which is, if you're not with us, you're not really American, you're not really, you don't really belong to the nation. So I think that's a concern, and that's a sort of soft concern that could have consequences for our democracy over the long run. But I work mostly on the courts and the judiciary, so let me talk about that. The judiciary, we usually think of that as a key component in the system of checks and balances. We've seen it work a little bit in slowing down some of the policies that Trump's appointees have pursued, or that he himself has pursued. So what about the courts? When Trump took office, there were twice as many open seats as there were when Obama took office, in part because the Republicans had been sitting on all those seats and refusing to confirm Obama's appointees, including, of course, famously, the Supreme Court seat. He has already appointed more judges than most presidents had by this time in their presidency. By the end of the first term, he will likely have appointed half of all federal judges. In other words, even if he's gone after 4 years. Including as many as 3 Supreme Court justices, including a swing court justices, right? The swing vote on the court and a reliably liberal vote on the court, shifting the balance on the court significantly to the right for the foreseeable future. His nominees have been on average 48 years old, right? Setting us up for 30 years, right, of jurisprudence coming out of these judges. I'm going to cherry pick, right? But one of them, called Justice Kennedy, the swing justice on the court, a judicial prostitute for trying to find middle ground. He said he would legalize the criminal prosecution of gay people under sodomy laws. Another thinks Roe v. Wade is as bad or worse than the Dred Scott opinion, which declared that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. And in the process of doing this, right, Trump and Senate Republicans are changing all the sort of soft norms around how you do this, right? So the rules aren't slowing them down at all. And again, the consequences of this will play out over the next 30 years. Now we could say, this is exactly how our democracy is supposed to work. Presidents and the Senate get to appoint justices, right? I mean, that's how we've designed the system. We may not like the policy consequences, but maybe it's not a problem for democracy. It's just a problem for us who don't like what these judges are going to do. Let me hold that until the end of the next point, which is the last one I'm going to make. Curt tells us that it looks like the Democratic Party lost its way, emphasizing identity politics, ignoring the less educated working class, that we academics may be out of touch, have to rethink things as well. But I think we have to be a little careful not to overinterpret the election results. We were surprised by the result because of the polls and because we couldn't believe a candidate like Trump could win. But a few tens of thousands of votes going in the other direction, we would be having the opposite conversation about how out of touch the Republican Party is and how they've lost their way and everything else. And actually, if you judge from what's happened since the election, from the healthcare debate, from the gender issues debates, and so on, it seems to me, I think this is right, that the Republican Party won and regularly wins elections in spite of being out of sync with a majority of the country, and not because they tapped into what we really care about, where the Democrats lost their way. And that brings me back to my first point, which is our institutions are already pretty screwed up and anti-democratic. And the problem is that our elections don't produce results that truly reflect the distribution of preferences in the country. And then we cement those results in place through redistricting and gerrymandering. So on the one hand, yes, I agree with Curt's conclusion that, so far it looks like Trump is more likely to be a largely failed one-term president who ushers in a democratic, in both senses of the term, backlash, than he is to be the next Hugo Chávez or Fujimori. I have to say, though, that I surely hope this is, as Abe Lowenthal said, thoughtful wishing and not wishful thinking. But I think that's probably the more likely outcome. But I don't think the backlash is inevitable at all. I think it's going to require leadership, organization, mobilization. It's going to require Democrats to be able to come out and vote. And not just Democrats, but it's going to require moderates, Republicans, to agree that there are things that are worse than voting for the opposite party or voting for a moderate. And for this, the institutional path that Curtis recommended seems less promising, in no small part because it's exactly our deeply problematic institutional arrangements that stand in the way of elections that might actually better reflect our national preferences. So it seems to me that at least part of the conversation we need to be having, maybe here, maybe in other contexts, is not just how can we protect our institutional safeguards, but how can we fix them.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for discussion before our coffee break. So I will take questions now. They can be directed to all of the panelists or any individuals. Bart.
This was really a fascinating panel. I went from gleeful optimism to feelings of doom once again. That was kind of normal for the last few months. I guess my biggest worry with Steve, thank you. My biggest worry with Steve is about foreign policy crisis and or terrorism. We've seen what happens from our own experience. In this case, we don't actually need to look elsewhere to find parallels, right? So post 9/11, tremendous rally around the flag effect, tremendous rally around the government and president effect from both parties. And of course, that allowed for the passage of the Patriot Act and various other strategies at the time. And much of the reaction depends on the framing of the problem, of course, by the administration and others. And actually, Bush was, he tried to inoculate the response to some degree against some of the worst backlashes, partly successfully, but not entirely. And so I guess my concern is exactly that. And as we hear every week, we're getting closer and closer to a potentially devastating conflict with North Korea, but there are other possibilities. So I guess my question would be how you think about that, Curt? Do you think that that is potentially the most dangerous and uncertain part of your narrative, or do you think that even in the case of a pretty terrifying conflict or crisis, there would be an optimistic path forward and some constraint by the checks and balances?
Let's take a few more questions, and then we'll have panelists respond. Other, Cristóbal?
Thank you very much for the comments. This is very interesting indeed, and I have one comment related to the overall topic about partisan polarization. And my feeling is, imagine that Trump is not the president today, but the other candidate was very strong in the polls was Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is probably not a populist, but he's real ideologue. To be honest, I would be even more worried if he would be the president. I mean, he literally said, the Bible goes over the Constitution. So this and ISIS, it's like small steps, so to say. So to what extent, going back to the comments of Steve and also of Dan Brinks, the problem is Trump, or there are ongoing issues in American democracy that are pretty scary, and one of them is, of course, the issue of partisan polarization. And based on that, a second comment is the issue of the Republican Party. I would say the key question is how the Republican Party is going to react. And being a political scientist and not an expert on US American politics, how the hell do we classify that party? Is still a mainstream right party? Or are we talking about a populist radical right party? Should we say that? So that's for me the key question. Probably we don't know yet how it's going to move, but this is the key factor for thinking about the future of this country.
Got a question from Jeff Tulis in the back.
situations for reactions from Curt and anybody else. The first is on the issue of crisis. Everybody's talking about whether a crisis might just emerge. But since the 60s, at least, with the presidency, we've had the phenomenon of manufactured crises. So particularly given the rhetoric the last couple days in the UN with North Korea and so forth, what about manufactured crises? The more important point, I think, is taking up Curt's most optimistic projection that there would be some sort of backlash. We certainly have lots of instances of backlash against policies and backlashes against dominant parties. But can anybody think of a single instance in American political history in which norm erosion of an important sort has been reversed? I can't. It seems to me that norm erosion of important norms has only gone in a direction of decay. Thank you.
It seems like that Trump is trying to reverse everything Obama ever did, and so the executive action aspect, how much of that is Congress ceding their power to the president? How significant is that? Secondly is anything they pass through Congress, it seems that if the Republicans want it, he will support it and sign it. It doesn't matter the content of that. Think ACA, for example. It doesn't matter what's in it so much as just so they pass something and support their campaign promise type of thing. So the empty legislation of sorts, or the destructive legislation, or backpedaling legislation, whatever you want to call it. So.
Great. Bertim, did you have, we'll take Bertim's question here.
Thank you for your presentations. I would like to go back to the question whether this is about populism or about Trump. That is, in the end, it seems to be that you're mostly against Trump and his policies and so forth, not necessarily because he's populist or so, I would say, unless we would accept what some of you and other people in the panel this afternoon, I think, will argue that populism may or may not be inherently attached to authoritarian traits. I mean, that might be the reason to link the both, but I wasn't yet sure whether we reached that point yet. And building on Dan Brinks' comments, like saying that the American political system is not that, has to be fixed, at least. So is that a call for, let's say, a good populist kind of revolution? Because basically you're pointing to the people being underrepresented, right? So I'm not sure whether we have yet solved the link Trump and populism.
This will be the last question for the first round, and then we'll let them respond. Go ahead.
So my question is a bit related to the manufactured crisis aspect, because one of Curt's points was that the economic performance is good enough that that Trump should not be able to use this to his benefit. But I wonder if we're not conflating two things, which is the actual performance of the economy and the subjective perception of it, which is right now in the US, I think, quite poor. And so if this is the case, and if we are conflating these two things, then Trump has a far better shot than we think, right? Because he may be able to use that to his advantage, even though the economy is actually in a pretty decent state.
Curt, you want to respond?
So on the crisis, what you see is a lot of the right-wing populists are benefited by crises that are dramatic, but that can be resolved fairly easily, right? So hyperinflation is a traumatic catastrophe for large parts of the population, but you can end it fairly dramatically. What people complain about here in the United States, loss of industrial jobs and declining incomes and whatever, that's, you can say, you can frame that as a crisis, it's a bomb, whatever, but he's not going to resolve that, you know, with one like decree, end of hyperinflation. I mean, in some sense, I think Trump is really kind of, he would have been much more scary if he had been more skillful. If he had come in and taken office and said, I have $1 trillion infrastructure plan. We are going to build roads, we're going to build bridges, we're going to build whatever, going to make people happy, I'm going to create millions of jobs. The Democrats, how can I, oppose government intervention? He could have gotten much more support. So, I mean, thank you for not being that smart. So, the manufacturer crisis, I mean, I think for getting domestic support to infringe on liberties, to enhance presidential powers. I think that would happen if you had a terrorist attack like 9/11, but you're not going to manufacture that very easily. I mean, we don't think that he's going to talk like to ISIS, hey, can you do something? He can manufacture a foreign policy crisis like with North Korea, but and that is also my biggest concern. I mean, my biggest concern about the man is first for survival, that he gets into some big trouble, and also for domestic politics that he wouldn't support would be a crisis with North Korea or with Iran, something like that. But I don't think that would give him a lot of support for changing domestic rules and institutions. I mean, if it were terrorism like 9/11, you could say, the police has to be stronger, we have to vet people, we have to ban people, all that kind of thing. I mean, he's not going to ban immigration from North Korea when he gets into war with them, right? It's not I don't think it would work like that. So the manufacturable crisis, I think, would have less of an impact on domestic politics. The crisis that would be much more dangerous in that respect, allowing him to put pressure and threats to democracy, I think, is much less manufacturable. I'm not an American politics specialist, as everybody knows, but I think the Republican Party is in many ways key. And who can make sense of that outfit? I mean, Ken in the paper says they've turned into a movement party. Yeah, there is a movement, but the Tea Party wasn't even initially with Trump because they were much more economically liberal, and he is a nationalist. The Republican leadership didn't want the guy, right? There's the Ted Cruz wing. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, when you think about it, in some sense, Trump is a very big problem for the Republican Party, right? And I mean, I think that might come to a head in the midterm election. What are they going to make of the man? What if the man's popularity goes down to 30, 28%? Are they going to, stay with him and they set themselves up for a disaster in the midterm election? Or do they say, you are a lunatic and you are a weirdo, we're just going to dump Trump and we're moving in another direction? So let me just make those comments, and so we have Steve.
All right, a couple of points really quickly. On crisis in 9/11. So the 9/11 attacks raised Bush's approval rating to the highest in the history ever recorded in the United States, 91%. But Bush actually exercised quite a bit of forbearance. I mean, we may disagree with the Patriot Act, but he actually did not, I would argue, exploit that crisis for partisan gain. And he didn't go after minorities. He did not engage. He did not abandon mutual toleration. He didn't deploy his powers to the hilt. I mean, he did things. He waged a war that I think was incredibly catastrophic, but he did not exploit the crisis in a way that was damaging to U.S. democracy. I would argue he engaged a fair amount of forbearance. And my fear is that Trump, everything about Trump suggests that he would not, that he would exploit the crisis to the hilt. Now, manufacturing crisis. For the book, we've actually looked into a bunch of other cases, and there have been in history a fair number. I don't know how many. I guess you have to be our age or older, but the movie Wag the Dog, I think, has been in a lot of people's minds. Is that from the 80s or the 90s? 90s. And there have been such cases. Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines largely manufactured the crisis that he used to establish martial law. Getulio Vargas, the sort of communist plot that was used for the 37 coup, right, was basically invented. I actually think that's pretty unlikely. I would be actually even more forceful than Curt. I mean, given the media and leaks, I think the idea of a truly manufactured crisis. I mean, the guy can't talk to the Prime Minister of Australia without it being leaked. So how they can plot seems pretty far-fetched. That said, a real crisis can be magnified, can be exploited in various ways. I don't think he needs to, unfortunately, invent a crisis. Just two other very quick points. I fear that we are too polarized for there to be the kind of democratic backlash that Curt mentions. If Mueller comes up with a bunch of smoking guns and Trump is impeached, a lot of us will say, wow, we need to prevent this from ever happening again. A third of the country will see it as a coup d'etat. Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity will be describing this event as a coup d'etat. A third of the country will interpret this as an undemocratic removal of Trump from office. Given the nature of partisan polarization, I can't imagine, it's difficult to imagine any event, even sort of a worst case scenario, in which our society comes together around democratic norms. It seems very unlikely. Now, I'm far, far, far from an expert in either U.S. history or U.S. politics, but it does seem to me there was a decline of norms in the 1850s running into the Civil War that eventually, for not very attractive reasons, were put behind us beginning in the late 1870s and 1880s with the basically the decision to abandon Reconstruction. The two parties became acceptable to one another and rebuilt democratic norms starting in the late 19th century. That's one case of, not for the best reasons, but a rebuilding of democratic norms.
Right. Right, based on racial exclusion.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah, so I think I only have one thing to say, and that is, is the way out a good populist revolution rather than a bad one? And I don't think that's what I'm looking for, really. So, which also doesn't make me terribly hopeful in a way, because, right, for the two issues that I identified specifically, which is sort of malapportionment and gerrymandering, right, for the one we would need a constitutional amendment, and if we open up sort of the constitutional Pandora's box, I'm not sure what we get in today's context, right, in part because of this terrible polarization. And for the other, we need the Supreme Court to step up and start saying, look, you can't just draw districts to disenfranchise people who disagree with you. And the court has actually granted cert, taken a case to talk about gerrymandering for partisan purposes, but I'm not, frankly, terribly hopeful that what we're going to get out of this court is a step forward, at least a very strong step forward. And certainly, if we wait until there's another appointment and another appointment, then I'm even less hopeful. So over the long run, what I'm looking for really is sort of better representative institutions, not necessarily a good populist revolution. But for that, I don't know what we need. I don't know how we get there.